Good evening to everyone who's joining in. We are live on Facebook. We are live on YouTube now. This is uh, IIT Gandhinagar Humanities and Social Sciences presents a talk, uh, which is part of a course that I've been teaching this semester on literary modernism. And Professor Daniel Katz from University of Warwick has been generous enough to agree to do this talk as part of the course. And we thought we would make it available for anyone who's interested in the larger community in and out of IIT Gandhinagar who would be interested in this talk. And Professor Katz will be talking about Bob Kaufman. So in this course, just to introduce the question a little bit, in this course, we have not so far looked at the question of race and modernism and black writing and modernism. So I'm particularly interested in Dr. Katz's perspective on Bob Kaufman, who's a very important American poet of the Beat generation. And again, looking at the kind of networks we have seen with Beat generation in the transnational sort of rubric of modernism. We have Beats coming into India and having a very interesting sort of cultural exchange with Indian writers, which actually led to the development of a movement like the Hungryalism or the Hungry generations. And here we have Kaufman, who shares a very interesting relation with Beats and also Dadaism, perhaps to a certain extent. Professor Katz will be talking about that. In this course, we've already looked at the Dadaist Manifesto, so there would be some continuity for the students who are joining in. So with that, a little bit of a contextualization, let me introduce Professor Katz here. So Professor Daniel Katz is Professor of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. He's the author of Saying I No More, Subjectivity and Consciousness in the Prose of Samuel Beckett, which came out from Northwestern University Press in 1999. American Modernism's Expatriate Scene, The Labor of Translation, which came out from Edinburgh University Press in 2007. And The Poetry of Jack Spicer, again, Edinburgh University Press, 2013. He's also the founding editor of the book series Bloomsbury Studies in Critical Poetics. His critical work has appeared in MLQ, Modern Fiction Studies, Textual Practice, Journal of Modern Literature, Keparl, the TLS, and Raritan. He is currently editing and annotating Be Brave to Things, the Uncollected Poetry and Plays of Jack Spicer. This is a book forthcoming from Wesleyan University Press next year. And he's also working on a new monograph for Oxford University Press, which is provisionally titled The Big Lie of the Personal, Poetry, Politics, and Death. Professor Katz today will be talking about Bob Kaufman and Black Dada, and his talk is titled My Soul is Moonburned, Bob Kaufman and the Abomunist Manifesto, or Dada Prodigies of Black. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk, Dan, and over to you now.
Thank you, Orko, so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be able to present this paper to you. I wish I could be there in person and meet you all, but hopefully this will be the next best thing. I'm just going to put my slides up now. That should only take a second, and then I will begin. So, okay. Orko, can you confirm that the slide is visible?
Not yet, but I guess it's coming. Just maybe we could give it a second.
Okay. You let me know.
Yep. It is visible now. Please go ahead, Dan.
Great. Yep. Thank you so much. My soul is moonburned, Bob Kaufman memorably declares in an untitled poem beginning with the words, dark walking endlessly. In some ways, there's nothing new at the core of his dazzling turn of phrase. The moon has always been the night's sun, illuminating that dark space of change, uncertainty, desire, dream, and illusion in a parallel manner to how the sun gives forth what William Butler Yeats called, quote, the prosaic light of day. Indeed, Yeats's great poem, The Tower, insists that sanity itself depends on telling these two shining orbs apart. I quote Yeats, "But they mistook the brightness of the moon for the prosaic light of day. Music had driven their wits astray." That's Yeats writing of certain men who made the great error of interpreting art as if it were real. In such a framework, which goes well beyond Yeats, one can imagine, as Kaufman does here, that the maddening moon on too much exposure will burn and wound the sensitive soul, just as the substantial body and its enveloping skin can be scorched by the sun in daytime. In this respect, still closer to Kaufman than Yeats would be one of Kaufman's favorite poets, Federico Garcia Lorca, in whose work the moon is a near constant and operates in cognate ways. Indeed, with his Moonburned soul, Kaufman expresses his wounded allegiance to the surrealist aesthetic so important to his own, and pointedly refuses to protect himself from the night's disarticulating dangers, embracing surrealism's openness to madness, to an excess beyond reason. And this embrace cost Kaufman dearly. He was repeatedly institutionalized against his will for mental disorders and was also subjected, again, against his will, to electroshock therapy. In a clever and economical turn of phrase then, and with the incisive irony characteristic of much of his work, Kaufman here digs deep into very ancient polarities, governing oppositions such as reason and madness, reality and imagination, or body and mind. But there's more to this phrase, of course, because the dark walking this poem evokes is more than that of the night through which the speaker trudges over, and I quote, these anguished floors of earth. This is for an obvious reason. For Kaufman, crucially, the phrase also and explicitly implies the darkness of the walker himself. This poem mentions, for example, I quote, "My body a sinewed hurt for all the nothing that I am, the nothing that is all my mingles of African hair." And the poem tells the reader, "I dreamed an African dream." Before we even get to the soul, remember that as a person of color in the USA, Kaufman would inevitably find himself defined in opposition to normative whiteness, and thus have been subject to the old tropes of the suntanned or sunburned body, tropes which he here transposes onto the soul and the moon in a supplemental bit of wit. That is to say that even if Kaufman explicitly adopts the party of night, soul, and imagination, the trope of the moonburn cannot help but cast a different light on a dark-skinned man, who will always be placed otherwise with regard to the polarities of light and dark which are so central to these tropisms, as well as to that related one of disclosure and concealment. This latter is perhaps even more crucial to Kaufman, whose work everywhere touches on African-American cultural motifs of fugitivity, anonymity, invisibility, and flight, as all his best critics have noted. Indeed, the phrase dark walking endlessly also implies a dark transit that would be interminable, or the state of transit as a constant, perhaps a traversing of borders. And it's worth evoking some borders now, not only the borders Kaufman crossed, but also the ones he took with him wherever he went, the borders that crossed him. Born and raised in New Orleans, one of the most ethnically and culturally complex sites in the entire United States, like so many other African Americans, before and since, who were born in the South, Kaufman migrated north and spent most of his adult life in San Francisco and New York City. But Kaufman took with him not only his immediately visible blackness, but also his name. And this is significant. Kaufman is not a common name among African Americans. It is, however, a very common one among American Jews, and his name was frequently received as Jewish by his peers. Kaufman's mixed ethnicity inevitably led to a widespread and predictable exoticist fantasy, perhaps ironically encouraged by Kaufman himself at times, that he was the offspring of a Haitian voodoo priestess and an Orthodox German Jew. You can still find this in some of the criticism. It's not true. In fact, though Kaufman did shroud his biography in some mystery, the consensus seems to be that he was raised in a middle-class Catholic family in New Orleans, which would not have been considered interracial according to the customs and, more importantly, the racist legislation of the time. The last name Kaufman apparently derives from his paternal grandfather, and it's not clear that his family maintained any clear connections to Jewish culture or ritual. But still, the Jewish name and the Catholic upbringing, both uncommon for African Americans, though by no means unheard of, these only add to the borders and divisions through which Kaufman had to negotiate his own sense of identity, and through which this identity was fabricated and even anticipated by others. This sense of simultaneous invisibility and hypervisibility, so common to African American writers, is met by Kaufman with responses which are alike characteristic of the African American intellectual tradition. A theatrical emphasis on visibility, the spectacular and exposure on the one hand, but an equally theatrical scrambling of stable identifications, deployment of masks, and plays on invisibility, pseudonymity, and inauthenticity on the other. In Kaufman's case, we at times approach a critique of the notion of identity itself. Orko, is everything all right? Is the transmission clear?
Yes, absolutely. Perfect.
Perfect, thank you. It's somewhat uncanny speaking into the emptiness.
It is, and quite modernist too, right?
Exactly. Okay. All this is seen in Kaufman's relationship to the Beat movement in San Francisco and New York. At the height of the movement in the mid-50s and early 60s, Kaufman, born in 1925 and died in 1986, Kaufman was one of the most prominent Beat poets in San Francisco and also a well-known media figure as the Beats began to emerge nationally as a byword for a scandalous and dangerous new American youth. This started pretty much in 1957 with the publication of Jack Kerouac on the Road, along with the Howell obscenity trial in San Francisco. In fact, Kaufman is sometimes considered the first beatnik in the most literal sense. It seems that the word was coined by a San Francisco journalist in reference to none other than Kaufman himself. Legend has it that he was one of the most frequently arrested people in San Francisco, and there is no question that in addition to the arrests, he was subjected to a deliberate campaign of additional beatings and harassments by the San Francisco police, something that unfortunately is very much in our contemporary news. This is partly because, as a friend and editor put it, Kaufman, quote, horrified the locals with his unruly antics, unquote, being one of the most provocative and confrontational members of the San Francisco counterculture. Surely the simple fact that he was a black man, and what's more, a black man with a white wife and an interracial child, surely this fact played the predominant role in the brutality to which he was constantly subjected. Kaufman was one of the very few prominent African Americans in the San Francisco, New York, and Beat counterculture. It's no coincidence that he was the most victimized. Beyond the public notoriety, and more important for us, however, Kaufman was also famous for his poetry readings in which he recited from memory. Indeed, his commitment to orality, to the idea of the poetic as a scene and an event rather than an inert art product, made him reticent to commit his work to writing at all. This, coupled with Kaufman's own love of jazz and frequent references to it, led to highly racialized myths of Kaufman as a black jazz poet, of spontaneous improvisational genius rather than a sober and deliberate craftsman. We know these myths are false. Kaufman's general practice was to very carefully compose and revise his poems. However, most of the time, not always, he did this entirely in his head. His memory was apparently eidetic, and he preserved relatively few written copies or drafts. Much of the poetry of his that we have was transcribed by others, sometimes from tape recordings of his readings. Today, however, I want to look closely at a work that doesn't follow this paradigm of orality. Kaufman's famous Abomunist Manifesto, first published in San Francisco in 1959, initially in the magazine Beatitude, which Kaufman himself helped edit, and later that year in A City Lights Broadside, which quickly became ubiquitous on the San Francisco scene. The manifesto is a quintessential production of the Cold War 1950s. Its play on communist and bomb, at once referencing the McCarthyite Red Scare and nuclear terror, while the abomination, a word it encodes, refers to the fierce, highly politicized policing of social norms for which the McCarthyite period is so infamous. This last element places it within the anti-establishment and anti-authoritarian trends so characteristic of the Beat movement generally. But I want to examine the aspects of this piece that also separate it from typical Beat stances, which, often based on an individualism that is frequently grounded in white and male privilege, as well as pre-critical concepts of freedom, are politically naive at best. Kaufman, who had probably been a member of the Communist Party as a younger man, retains an internationalist outlook that separates him from the American exceptionalism of much of the Beat movement, as well as a capacity for structural political analysis that counters the individualism mentioned above. As James Smethurst has argued, some elements in the manifesto and Kaufman's work generally can be linked to the popular front culture of the 30s and 40s, which Kaufman surely knew. And Smethurst points out the overlap between the popular front and left-wing surrealism. But what I would like to look at today is how Kaufman also collides that popular front surrealist culture with a movement which in many ways opposed and complicated it, while also remaining on its fringes or borders. That is, the radical, skeptical, and destructive energies of Dada in its vexed and uneasy relationship to surrealism and politically engaged art generally. The Abomunist Manifesto begins with an unnumbered series of 14 declarations in typical manifesto style, which are followed by notes and addenda in various forms. For example, a section titled Excerpts from the Lexicon Abomunam, or an Abomunist Election Manifesto, as well as an Abomunist Rational Anthem, made entirely of nonsense words, and two short hipster parodies of foundational texts for normative American culture in the 50s, the Gospels of Christ and Letters of the Founding Fathers of the American Revolution. The opening manifesto contains lines like these, and you should have a slide up with some of these statements from the Abomunist Manifesto. So this is just some examples. Abomunists join nothing but their hands or legs or other same. Abomunists spit anti-poetry for poetic reasons and frink. Abomunists do not feel pain, no matter how much it hurts. Abomunists do not write for money. They write the money itself. Abomunist poets, confident that the new literary form footprintism has freed the artist of outmoded restrictions, such as the ability to read and write, or the desire to communicate, must be prepared to read their work at dental colleges, embalming schools, homes for unwed mothers, homes for wed mothers, insane asylums, sane asylums, USO canteens, kindergartens, and county jails. Abomunists never compromise their reactionary philosophy. Just to note there, in America at least, the term home for unwed mother is a euphemism for institutions that took in unmarried women who got pregnant. Homes for wed mothers is, of course, just a joke of Kaufman. Anyone familiar with the classic manifestos of the historical avant-garde will recognize many elements here: wit, exuberance, the use of the peremptory and categorical as a rhetorical mode, and not least, a deployment of hyperbole which constantly verges on the edge of auto-irony. This instability is particularly pointed in the last item on the list. One might be tempted to think that footprintism, with its elimination of reading, writing, and communicating, is meant to be taken as a parody of avant-garde pretensions and an implicit critique. However, the list of institutions that follow, with their emphasis on the marginal and excluded, are not presented here as objects of disdain. Kaufman himself spent a good deal of time in insane asylums and county jails. If footprintism is not meant to be taken literally, it is meant to be taken seriously nevertheless. The strictures it mentions are fully part of the anti-poetry which exists for poetic reasons. The form...
Dan, sorry to interrupt. We are still stuck with the first slide for some reason.
Oh dear. That's...
Yep. Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
You got the slide now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I'll give you a couple seconds to just read over because those quotes might have come quite fast. Okay, I'll take it up again. If footprintism is not meant to be taken literally, it is meant to be taken seriously nevertheless. The strictures it mentions are fully part of the anti-poetry which exists for poetic reasons. This form of destructiveness and allegiance to anti-art links Kaufman to a strain of Dada very much at odds with the surrealism of expansiveness, amplitude, and transcendence, which was far more prevalent in the Beats, and which is also a major vector of Kaufman's own work in other places. Yet another link to this side of Dada is that odd word frink, which takes on an increasingly important role as the manifesto continues, and notably appears in another context that valorizes the concept of non-communication. I quote, "Since it is election time, abomunists are going to frink more, we are told," and I quote, "and naturally, as hardcore abos, we will feel the need to express ourselves somewhat more abominably than others. We will do this simply by not expressing ourselves." Abominization. We will not express ourselves in the following terms. The idea that one expresses by not expressing oneself is not a joke for Kaufman, who engaged in a 10-year vow of silence between 1963 and 1973, and for whom the motif of non-communication recurs throughout the work. Another example of this in the manifesto is the so-called rational anthem, so not national anthem, but rational anthem, which we are told should be sung before and after frinking, and which consists entirely of nonsense words. That said, the question of the meaning of words is the explicit burden of the, quote, excerpts from the lexicon Abomunon, to which the preceding passage serves as a preface. This lexicon contains 27 entries. 24 are based on the root abomu, and 3 on frink. The list often works by circular definition. For example, abomunicate is defined as to dig, slang to frink, and abomunize is defined as, quote, to carefully disorganize, usually associated with frinking. Meanwhile, abomunity is, quote, a byproduct of abomunarcosis, also obtained by frinking, thus Frinkism. But if following this chain, we refer to abomunarcosis, we find out it is, quote, an addiction to oatmeal cookies and liverwurst. At this point, given how many of the previous meanings depend on that of Frink, the reader looks forward to the last 3 entries of the lexicon, which I will produce in full. Let me know, do you have the slide?
Not yet. We are still with the second slide.
Let me try again. Do you have it now?
Not yet, but
Oh,
we
dear.
can wait a second, perhaps.
Coming up?
Not yet, I'm afraid.
All right, I'm going to try what I did. I'll try one more time to go back to the previous slide and then slide
Sure.
into this one and see if
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Okay. Anything?
We are still in the second slide.
All right. Well, I guess we'll have to proceed this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Apologies. So, what you'd see here, if you could see the slide, it's set up like a dictionary entry, right? You know, with like, you know, when you have when you open a dictionary and you have like a list of words. So, Frink, verb, to, censored, noun, censored, and censored. The next item on the list is Frinkism, noun, a subcult of abomunism, not authorized nor given abominitude by Baumkauf. Baumkauf is listed as the author of the entire text. And the last entry is Frinky, adjective, like censored. Still no sign of the slide?
Not really. Should I just try and present from my end and see if that works? Because I think I have the PowerPoint.
I made a couple changes in the PowerPoint,
oh, okay,
unfortunately.
Okay.
I should have sent you the new one.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Still not coming up.
No, I mean, the other thing that possibly could be done is if you could, you know, stop presenting and present again, because it might be stuck somehow. I don't know why.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Sorry about this. Thank you.
No, it's let's see if this works. All right, I'm going to relaunch it. Any luck?
We can see the Frink slide now. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, this will keep us busy for a little longer. Clearly, if Frink implies a well-known obscene verb, which begins with F and ends with K, Kaufman doesn't allow the equivalence to remain so simple, implying other valences which remain obscured. For example, that obscene word I just mentioned in English doesn't have an adjectival form at all, unlike Frinky. Is Frink then a mixture of this well-known obscene word as well as think, freak, and funk? Impossible to say it isn't. Yet, note that one of the rhetorical valences of the entire manifesto is to obstruct an easy translation of Frink to the most likely censored word or to any other. And this has the additional effect of opening the question of what that occluded word or words really mean anyway. The point is not to give Frink a sense, but to work with how it asks for, yet resists, this sense. In other words, Frink insists on the question of sense and nonsense, which is vital to the entire Abomunist project, and also, as an invented defining word of indeterminate definition, I think it shows itself to be in dialogue with an important precursor. As far as I know, no Kaufman scholar has made this connection, but I believe that in the background of the Abomunist Manifesto lies Kurt Schwitter's important article Merz of 1920. This piece was published in English translation in Robert Motherwell's 1951 anthology, The Dada Painters and Poets, which was very widely circulated in advanced poetry circles in the US in the 50s. There's every chance Kaufman would have seen it. And there's much in here that prefigures Kaufman. For example, Schwitters criticizes the concept of expression throughout. I quote, "Today, the striving for expression in a work of art also seems to me injurious to art." End of quote. There's also a good deal of attention paid to nonsense. But most important for our purposes is to consider Schwitters' term Merz as a forerunner of Frink. Although scholars habitually link Merz to the German word Kommerz, or business, Schwitters himself says something else. Has the new slide appeared?
Yes.
Excellent. So this is Kurt Schwitters. It's, the word Merz had no meaning when I formed it. Now it has the meaning which I gave it. The meaning of the concept Merz changes with the change in the insight of those who continue to work with it. Interesting here is how quickly a Vedic conception of the artist as namer, creator, and origin of meaning, now it has the meaning which I gave it, is immediately countered by a conception of chance, contingency, collaboration, and historical accident. This is in fact consonant with how Schwitters aims in his art, and I quote, to play off sense against nonsense. And indeed, it catches the enabling contradiction at the heart of Schwitters' endeavors. For Merzbau, his art form is essentially assemblage art, comprised of found objects, even if these objects might be, as Schwitters specifies, letters, syllables, words, or sentences, which are then combined and assembled, but not with an expressive intent. Schwitters says, "The medium is as unimportant as I myself," or a more recent translation says, "The material is as unimportant as I myself." And he goes on to say, "Essential is only the forming." This fascinating essay, which appeared the same year as the book publication of Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, contains an analogous tension. On the one hand, Schwitters calls for an art in which both the material of the work and the artist are entirely random and inconsequential. An art freed from all fetters, as Schwitters says, and tolerant of, quote, any artistically motivated limitation. On the other hand, this openness to the unaesthetic, the found object, and the meaningless is only viable for Schwitters if these elements are redeemed by what he calls form, an ideal concept which comes to take the place that meaning or expression might hold in more conventional accounts. In this way, if art becomes non-representational and inexpressive, it nevertheless perseveres as ideal and complete. It is for this reason that Schwitters attacks another Dadaist, Richard Hilsenbeck. Schwitters attacks Hilsenbeck for having written, quote, "All in all, art should get a sound thrashing." Schwitters specifies that this view, quote, "is oriented toward politics and against art and culture. Such an outlook is alien to Merz," end of quote. Schwitters insists that Merz, on the other hand, is sympathetic to the side of Dadaism, which, quote, "holds to the good old traditions of abstract art," end of quote. In other words, for all his radicalism concerning material, meaning, expression, originality, and intention, Schwitters maintains a belief in the art product and has no quarrel with art as a social institution. One might say that for Schwitters, the meaninglessness of art must not be allowed to have a meaning of its own, a position at once more and less demanding, more and less naive than that of the political Dada, which Schwitters rejects. It is more demanding in that it refuses the dialectical recuperation of Dada negativity into a positive cause, which is the foundation of Hilsenbeck's position. Hilsenbeck, for example, joins Schwitters in mocking expressionism, but only because for him the expressionists, under the pretext of turning inward, have become quietist and bound to the same idea of aesthetic value that Schwitters maintains by way of his praise of form and abstraction. But this position is less demanding in that, unlike Huelsenbeck and so many other Dadaists, Schwitters' position sees no relation between art as an economic and social institution and the works that are produced and circulate within these parameters. Here, one might turn to Dadaist George Grosz, who follows Schwitters in attacking the anti-art position of what Schwitters calls Husk Dada, but for entirely different reasons. In Grosz, we come full circle. The problem with anti-art or forms of art intended to shock is that, quote, the young man digests everything. In other words, the commodification machine happily processes even the art that tries to destroy it. For Grosz, it follows, therefore, quote, that our only mistake was to have been seriously engaged at all with so-called art, end of quote. Dada's true lesson, for Grosz, can only be the necessity of creating the kind of degraded, instrumentalized art Dada initially set out to oppose. Grosz concludes, and I quote, the rest of us saw the great new task, tendency art in the service of the revolutionary cause, end of quote. Okay, let's return to Kaufman after that excursus. In terms of Kaufman's Abomunist Manifesto then, we need to think of how Dada and Surrealism transfer from the context of their wartime European origins into the very different US scene. In a recent book on Surrealism as world literature, Delia Ungureanu has emphasized how the US importation of Surrealism markedly depoliticized it, especially under the auspices of influential gallery owner Sidney Levy, who organized the first major Surrealist art exhibit in the US in January 1932. Interestingly, 19 years later, Motherwell's Dada anthology in some ways follows suit. It edits out of Merz the phrases where Schwitters rebukes Huelsenbeck for insisting that radical communism is essential to Dada and for stating Dada is German Bolshevism. Is this because Motherwell frowned on Schwitters' anti-communism? Or because of the need in 1951 to downplay all connections between Dada and communism whatsoever? It is entirely possible that even Motherwell needed to smother the extent to which Dada was itself, for 1950s America, an abomination, though it is true that other sections of the book do at least mention the communist sympathies of some Dada figures. Kaufman's Dada certainly has a political edge, if not a coherent program. This comes from Kaufman's awareness throughout the text of regulatory regimes of power and their clear historical relation to the sense he doesn't always make. For example, to declare that the meaning of Frink is censored, rather than simply to erase or refuse it, is to enter into a very different kind of discussion than that of some other forms of minimalist elision. To put it another way, the sense Kaufman challenges is not essentialized, but presented through a series of specific ideological constructions: official radio news, national anthems, sacred texts, election manifestos. In this way, Kaufman steers clear of the occasional Dada tendency to hypostasize sense and nonsense, as Surrealism sometimes does with reason and the irrational. Beyond this, Kaufman's ambivalent repoliticization of Dada in his manifesto also takes the form of tonal modulations, in which the exuberant, confident, bombastic insouciance, so characteristic of the manifesto genre, gives way to expressions of weakness, doubt, or what Judith Butler calls susceptibility, a more complex relationship to the kind of pure agency which most manifestos call for. One can hear this note in the following bomb. I quote, "Misty-eyed, knee-quaking me, gazing on the family home, realizing that I was about to burn it down. Or, when attacked, abomunists think positive, repeating over and under, if I were a crime, I'd want to be committed. No, wait. Here, the joke is on the abomunists themselves. Meanwhile, Further Notes contains 2 lines which can be read as a compressed parable about the beat recourse to a mystified vision of Eastern wisdom in the construction of a perfect heteronormative whiteness. Zen can cause changes in the texture of your hair, removing you from the clutches of sexy barbers. These details are resonant, but also unstable. True to form, the Abomunist Manifesto refuses to allow itself to be corralled into an elaborated, coherent message, and resists being marshaled into the kind of argument critics are obliged to make. This in and of itself is nothing less than the kernel of Dada, as Schwitters himself might have put it. Kaufman's own version is markedly belated. Unlike the historical avant-garde, Kaufman has no serious pretensions of founding a new movement. Yet the Abomunist Manifesto is not therefore simply pastiche or irony. For example, Martin Puchner distinguishes the Socialist Manifesto from the Avant-Garde Manifesto by positing that the former is based on performativity, the latter on theatricality, though he is quick to point out that political manifestos also employ theatrical exaggerations, and that the so-called calculated theatricality of the avant-garde manifestos also, in Puchner's words, achieves some performative effect. However, surely part of the theatricality of the avant-garde manifesto is that the context where it is let loose is not the theater or fiction, but rather everything that is meant to oppose that pair and that we don't know how to name: reality, life, the world, etc. In other words, it's different to publish a manifesto and to have a character in a novel write one. Part of the fiction of the avant-garde manifesto is that it is not fictional. And we have seen how one endpoint of this logic is to finally refuse art itself in the name of the entirely real. On the other hand, it is precisely by problematizing claims to be real that the Abomunist Manifesto goes beyond theatricality and can actually comment on the conditions of political intervention and social determinations. The manifesto functions as the flip side and supplement to Kaufman's poetry, working as an anti-poetry that has a poetic reason. It works as a refusal to let Kaufman's Orphic oral poetry of the event and community erase all forms of mediation, negation, surplus, and non-communication. Because in his poetry proper, Kaufman is capable of notable lyric power and intensity. And frequently we find here in various forms the shadows of a recurrent question, not unlike that with which we began. What can one's relationship to negativity be, dialectical or not, when one's racialized self and body is already a culturally hallowed figure of the negative itself? We see this in one of his well-known early poems, Celestial Hobo. Orko, is Celestial Hobo up on the screen?
No, we're still with the Zen can cause changes in the texture of your hair, that reference.
Yeah, okay. Let me try again.
Sure.
Is it up now?
Not yet, unfortunately.
All right, so I'm going to do what I did before because this is a text I think you need to see.
Yep.
So we'll stop presenting, and now I will present. How is that looking now?
Yeah, Forever Remember Dream, that's the one, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to just introduce it again to keep our thread. So I think this poem asks the question that comes up again and again in Kaufman: What can one's relationship to negativity be, dialectical or not, when one's racialized self and body is always already a culturally hallowed figure of the negative itself? Celestial Hobo. For every remembered dream, there are 20 nighttime lifetimes. Under multiplied arcs of sleep, zombie existences become existence. In night's warped rectangles, stormy bathtubs of wavy sex come hotly drawn. Every day, confused in desperate poses, loses its hue to Dada prodigies of black. There never was a night that ended or began. Here, Kaufman breaks with a surrealist emphasis on the liberatory dream and insists instead on the endless dark night that the dream itself obscures or represses. The everyday, another privileged surrealist category, is smothered by Dada prodigies of black. Black here, it would seem, is both the return of the surrealist repressed negativity in the shape of Dada, but also the resistance of racialized blackness to the exoticized meanings in which surrealism often inscribed it, despite its otherwise well-meaning and anti-colonialist intentions. Kaufman speaks for the night of the dream, as well as the nighttime lifetime, in which the poetic dreamer does not always show interest. In the long prose poem, 2nd April, Kaufman writes, quote, "A thing dipped in poems, the black child glistened in self-conceived madness," evoking a primal baptism, but also an auto-engenderment, self-conceived, in which the black child replaces the amniotic fluid with madness in poetry, a dazzling image of glistening, mad, procreative, poetic blackness. However, in the very same poem, he also writes, in a different vein, "That's a thing. My Negro suit has Jew stripes." Here, Kaufman is not only referring to his own mixed ethnicity, but also to historical constructions of racism, noting that the, quote, Negro suit in which whiteness dresses him is a variant of the stripes on the clothes of the death camp inmates, and vice versa. The glistening child bathed in madness and the adult in a Negro Jew suit work according to notably different rhetorical logic. But it would be hasty to conclude that the distinctions Kaufman's work often makes between skin and clothes is that between nature and culture. Rather, skin and clothes feature more as differing modes of marking, signifying, signaling, mediating, and hiding. But the Jew stripes are not something from which his poetry hides. One of the most powerful American poems on the Nazi death camps is, in fact, Kaufman's own Sullen Bakeries of Total Recall, which begins like this. Is that
Yes, it's up.
Is that screen up? Okay, great. So I'm going to read a little bit first that is not on the screen, and then we'll get to this. The poem begins like this. Sometimes I feel the ones who escaped the ovens where Germans shall forever cook their spiritual meals are leaning against my eyes. This line reveals the macabre and chilling sense of the bakery in the title, Sullen Bakeries of Total Recall. And the poem makes clear that the total recall is simply Kaufman's inability to forget. In some ways, a hyperbolic extension of Adorno's strictures on poetry after Auschwitz, the poem asks how any life at all can still continue after this monstrosity. So now the slide. My first reaction is to be angry with Moses for not committing suicide. My second reaction is to be furious with the Germans for not committing suicide. My third reaction is one of total disappointment for not committing suicide. I think of Chaplin and roll a mental cigarette. I slowly remove my bayonet. Write a poem about a poetic poem dedicated to the Aleutian Islands. Later in the same poem, Kaufman writes, I acknowledge the demands of surrealist realization, and yet when I think of those ovens, I turn my head in any other direction. Kaufman is unique among US poets of his generation in the way in which he brings the North American slave trade and its horrible legacies into conversation with the Nazi death camps. But there is another unspeakable tragedy to which he also often refers, and one which scrambles further any post-war US triumphalism and emphasis on Nazi crimes might foster, as well as contextualizing US anti-Black racism in a wider framework. Close, I'd like to read his poem, Plea. Is that up on the screen?
Oh, not yet, unfortunately.
We'll give it a second. I'm going to try and launch it again because you're going to need this.
Sorry about this.
No worries. We're all doing our best. Is it there?
I didn't see a relaunch actually. So no, we're still with the same slide.
All right, I'm gonna go back and do what I did before then.
Yeah.
Stop presenting, and then this is it. This is the last slide. So, and the end of the paper also. So. Okay.
Yes, it's up.
Okay, so to conclude, Plea. Voyager, wanderer of the heart, off to a million midnights, black, black. Voyager, wanderer of star worlds, off to a million tomorrows, black, black. Seek and find Hiroshima's children, send them back, send them back. Tear open concrete sealed cathedrals, spiritually locked. Fill vacant theaters with their musty diversions, almost forgotten laughter. Give us back the twisted sons poisoned by mildewed fathers. Find again the used up whores dying in some forgotten corner. Find sunlight and barking dogs for the lost, decayed and sorry jails. Find pity, find hell for wax bitches, hidden in the bowels of male Cadillacs. Find tomorrow and next time for Negro millionaires hopelessly trapped in their luxurious complexions. Find love and an everlasting fix for hopeless junkies, stealing into lost night, long time. Voyager now, off to a million midnights, black, black. Seek and find Hiroshima's children. Send them back, send them back. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. So if I may, just to kind of start the conversation, set up a few things that came out quite wonderfully in this talk. I mean, there was a very complex and layered reading of Kaufman and the contexts, including a sort of a, let's say, a falsification of some of the myths as well. I mean, the myth of the jazz street poet who doesn't revise anything, who is absolutely spontaneous and so on. So thank you so much for bringing in all those aspects, Dan. So for me, what was quite interesting was this opposition between surrealism and Dadaism, and the way Kaufman seems to use a kind of radical communist rhetoric of Dadaism against surrealism, as it were. I mean, that was one of the things that came out for me very interestingly. And also the manipulation of the manifesto as a particular genre, as a genre of modernism. In fact, in this course, we have read the Surrealist and the Dadaist manifestos, and Mina Loy's Feminist Manifesto as well. So
yeah.
how the manifesto genre works, and you know, as you were saying, Dan, about pastiche and irony, is it more than that? The distinctions between performativity and theatricality, and a kind of calculated theatricality of the manifesto as a genre. And finally, what really struck me was this particular question of the logic of race, the logic of race and the connection between racialization and negativity, the logic of negation, perhaps in a sort of a Hegelian sense as well. I mean, the relation with negativity and racialization, and this again, this wonderful idea that dream represses the night, dream represses blackness, as it were. And again, there would be echoes, I'm sure, for students who have gone through the classes on Nightwood. And I was also trying to connect some of those ideas with Blashaw's points about the night and the sleep in the space of literature, especially this very interesting argument Blashaw seems to make that there is a dialectical tension between night and sleep, to the point that sleep kills night and sleep prepares us for the day, but it also kills nocturnality. So this sort of tension between sleep and night, as it were, and again, we do have a figure of the black man in Juna Barnes's novel, in The Circus, though it's a marginal character, almost on the verge of a stereotype, as it were, but very interesting. So I was just trying to open up some threads of thought there. But so I would request students or anyone in the Google Meet session, I mean, you could just unmute yourself and ask a question if you like, rather than typing it. It's up to you. So could you?
Oh, sorry, am I interrupting you?